in-laws, my sisters-in-law, their kids, my mother and father-in-law. So I got to put a lot of this stuff into practice last week. I was just reminded of how I'm to be patient and peaceful and accepting of the people who kind of rub me the wrong way. Today we're going to wrap up this series, and if I have I have one left. I raised one, but at one point I had two teenagers in my house. And I'm a firm believer that every teenager at one point or another is a sandpaper person. If you have raised teenagers, if you are raising teenagers, you understand what I mean. I heard a story about a girl who was about 14, 15 years of age, and she was just going through a rough time at school. She was having trouble with her friends. She was having trouble in school. And she just continued to proclaim to everyone that there was no one in the world that liked her or loved her. And this all came to a head one day when she had failed a test in school. Her friend at school was being mean to her, and she came home and she was disobedient. Her parents corrected her, and she just exploded emotionally. And with great flamboyance, she threw herself on the couch and declared emphatically that no one in the world loves her and everyone hates her. Her little brother was sitting at the table doing his homework, and matter-of-factly, without even looking up from his homework, said, that's not true. At that moment, their parents had this great sense of pride that her younger brother would try to console his older sister in that way. And then without missing a beat, they discovered their pride was misplaced. Because without missing a beat, her little brother said, there's a lot of people who haven't even met you yet. And the truth is that you're going to meet a lot of people in your life that are going to rub you the wrong way. And the truth is that those people in our life that we find to be sandpaper people, the people that we think deserve love the least, are probably the people that need love the most. And that's what I want to talk to you about today as we kind of wrap up this series, Sandpaper People. If you remember, I've been telling you that, if you take a piece of sandpaper and you rub it across the grain of a piece of wood, that it's going to cause damage, it's going to cause blemishes, it's going to cause scratches in the piece of wood. But you can take that same piece of sandpaper and run it with the grain, and it brings out the beauty, and it's actually helpful to the piece of wood. And what we discovered is that the sandpaper never changes. What has changed is how the piece of wood is oriented to the sandpaper. And the same is true in our life, that all of us are going to have sandpaper people in our lives who probably are never going to change. But how we orient ourselves towards those people can actually make the difference between them being hurtful and harmful, or even being actually helpful in our lives to bring out the beauty that God had desired. And so I began this series a few weeks ago, and we talked about how God has encouraged us to be peaceful, not to get revenge, and we're to do right even when we have been wronged. And then I talked about how we are to be patient with those sandpaper people in our lives. And Paul encouraged the believers not to be critical in matters that are not critical, and just to be patient with one another. And then we saw how Paul encouraged us as believers to be accepting of those around us, even the sandpaper people, even the people that push all of our buttons. And we understood that we are more important than me. And if you were here last week, Pastor John shared there at the end of Romans, where Paul said that there are going to be people who are going to be consistently and constantly divisive and deceptive. And there are times in which maybe we need to be discerning and just subtract those people from our lives who divide. And today I kind of want to wrap up this series and talk about love, and how we are to love even the people that are abrasive and irritating and push all of our buttons at all the wrong times. And what we're going to discover is that Paul has framed this whole argument about how we're to deal with these sandpaper people, that he's framed it all through the lens of love, that love is kind of the umbrella that all of these other issues fall under. And not to be redundant again, but it's kind of the foundation that all of these are built upon. And it's that idea of love. And it goes all the way back to Jesus in John chapter 13. He said to his disciples, he said, I give you a new commandment, that you love one another, even as I have loved you, that you also love one another. This commandment was so revolutionary in the times in which Jesus said it. He said, I'm asking you to love one another as I have loved you. And that commandment has become the ethic of the church itself. It's the ethic by which every genuine believer in Jesus Christ should live their lives. And Paul is going to pick up on this commandment, this new commandment that Jesus had given. Paul's going to pick up on it here in Romans chapter 13. And he's going to encourage the believers as he begins his discussion on how to handle sandpaper people. The foundation of all of this is simply lead with love. He's going to say, hey, I'm going to take this commandment, this new commandment that Jesus has given to us, and I'm going to show you how this really is lived out in our lives. And he's going to encourage the believers in Rome. He's going to encourage you and I today to lead with love. That all of our conversations that we have with other people should be led with love. All of our interactions that we have with other people should be led with love. All of our reactions that we have to even the sandpaper people in our life, that they should be led with love. And so we're kind of going back, and we're coming back here to Romans chapter 13. And if you've ever been to a wedding, I'm sure you've probably heard the reading of 1 Corinthians 13. It's the love chapter. And maybe that chapter in the Bible is the most beautiful, the most descriptive definition of love. But here in Romans chapter 13, it's probably maybe the most succinct definition of love. Because in just 3 chapters, 75 English words, Paul very clearly defines what love is, what love looks like, and how love is to be lived out in our day-to-day lives, even with the people who rub us the wrong way. And what we're going to discover is he's going to encourage all of the believers to lead with love. And so in Romans chapter 13, beginning in verse number 8, the first thing that he says here, he says, as we orient ourselves in the right way, he says, I want this love to be a mark of how you live so that you are oriented in the right way towards these sandpaper people. And he gives, first of all, the requirement for love. If you look in verse 8, he says, let no debt remain outstanding except the continuing debt to love one another. He starts there with that phrase. He says, let no debt remain outstanding. Now, he's just got done, if you're familiar with Romans chapter 8, at the beginning of Romans chapter 8, Paul had talked about how believers are to be obedient to the government or to pay their taxes. And some people think that this is just a continuation of that idea, that we're not to owe anything to anyone. And that's probably 100% true, but I'm a relational type person. And so I think Paul is maybe even shifting gears here. And he's not so much talking about financially owing other people as he is talking relationally how we owe sometimes other people. Right? There are times in our life in which we treat people unfairly, or we speak about them behind their back or to their face. We speak about them harshly, or we do something to harm them, either emotionally or relationally, or sometimes even maybe financially. And what happens there is when we treat people like that, we owe them, right? We owe them an apology. Maybe we owe them better behavior. Maybe we owe them financially. Maybe we owe them a relationship. But whatever the case, when we harm the people around us, it leaves us in a debt-debtor relationship, and we owe them something. And I think maybe Paul has maybe that in mind. Probably not. When we get to heaven and I'm wrong, be sure to look me up and say that I was wrong when I said that. But he's saying, I don't want you to owe anything to anyone. I don't want you to be in debt relationally or financially or emotionally. I don't want you to be in debt to anyone except, he says, the continuing debt to love one another. He says the only thing that we owe to the people around us, the only thing we should owe them is a continuing debt of love. Listen to what he's saying here. He's saying this is a debt that we owe, but it's a debt that we can never repay. It's a continuing debt of love. And he says every single person that you come eye to eye with, you need to look at them, and the very first thought you ought to have is that I owe them love. I've lived here 4 years now. And in those 4 years, there have been 2 times I've borrowed money from Pastor John, okay? And I've borrowed money from Pastor John, and I wish I could say this differently, but it took me weeks to pay him back, like several weeks. Both times, I think one time was maybe even a couple months. And so I would always just forget that I owed him money. I never carry cash on me. And so every morning when Pastor John would come to the office and I would see him, you know what I was reminded of? Now, Pastor John didn't tell me that I owed him money. He never said that. But every time I saw him, the first thing that came to my mind was, I owe him money. And I would say to him, oh, John, I'm sorry, I owe you money. And then I'd go home that evening and I'd forget that I'd owed him money. And finally, one day I tried to pay him. I tried to pay him interest on the money that I owed him, but he wouldn't even take that. But Paul says, and I don't know if you've had the same situation in your life where you see somebody and you remember that you owe them. Paul says that's how we're to view love. That the requirement of love is that the moment we see that other person that we come eye to eye with, that the first thing ought to come to our mind is that I owe them the love of Jesus. I owe them to be loved the way he loved me. And we're to do this for the people who are like us as well as the people who are unlike us. We're to do this for the people that we like as well as the people that we dislike. We're to do this for the people that we get along with as well as the people who rub us the wrong way. And you may be saying, well, how do you know that? Well, look at what Paul said here. He said, let no debt remain outstanding except the continuing debt to love one another, for he who loves his fellow man has fulfilled the law. Now, the word, I love Greek language because it's a very descriptive language. And actually, the word other in the original Greek, you can actually use 2 different words there. There's one word that was used for other that was another of the same kind. So somebody that was like you, somebody that looked like you, somebody that had the same affinity as you. But there was another word that was used for other that meant another of a different kind, somebody who's not like you. And that's the word that Paul used here. He says, I want you to love one another. I want you to love your fellow man who doesn't have the same opinions as you, the person who doesn't look like you, the person who doesn't have the same ethnicity as you, the person who doesn't vote like you, the person who doesn't believe like you. He says, I want you to love everyone. That's the requirement. He says, you owe this to all of them. And then look at what he says at the end. He says, when you do this, you have fulfilled the law. And what Paul has in mind here is he's going back to what Jesus has said in Matthew chapter 22. In Matthew chapter 22, a young man came to Jesus and he said, Jesus, what is the greatest commandment? And Jesus said, the greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. And then without being prompted, Jesus said, and the second one is just like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. And then Jesus made this revolutionary statement. He said, on these 2 commands, love God, love others, hangs all the law and prophets. He says, if you want to fulfill all of the 10 commandments, it's pretty simple. Love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And love your neighbor as you love yourself. And when you do those 2 things perfectly, you have fulfilled the entirety of the law. You see, that's why love is required, to fulfill the law that God had given to us. And we fulfill the law when we lead with love. But Paul goes on, and he doesn't just give us the requirement of love, but secondly, he gives us the response of love. He says here, I think Paul understood that these believers in Rome, that they had an unashamed an unashamedly deep, passionate love for God, but he was wondering if they really loved one another, because that's why he spent the rest of Romans talking about how they're to interact with each other in a loving way. And so he goes on in verse 9, he says the commandments: do not commit adultery, do not murder, do not steal, do not covet, and whatever other commandment there may be, are summed up in this one rule: love your neighbor as yourself. If you look at what he says here, the commandments: do not commit adultery, do not murder, do not steal, do not covet, and whatever other commandment there are. He says all of these commandments, when you break these commandments, you are selfishly saying, I am more important than you. And my desires are more important than your desires. And what Paul is saying here, he's saying, listen, the response of love, if you really love the people around you, right, you're not going to commit or condone adultery. Like, if you really love your neighbor, you're not going to murder them. Love says, I'm not going to steal. Love says, I'm not going to covet the blessings that someone else has, because all of these things that he says here that we find in the Ten Commandments, he says every single one of these, none of these are victimless sins. That when you commit any of these sins, you're violating your neighbor and your brother. And you see, love is not just this feeling that's kind of out there, but love is, the response of love is something that's very tangible and very practical. And he goes on in verse 9, he says, whatever other commandment there may be are summed up in this one rule: love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no harm to its neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law. What he's saying here, he's saying, if you truly love God, it's going to be manifested in how you love the people around you. I remember when I was 19 years old, I was driving my car, and it was a Pontiac Sunbird, and I hit a deer, and it smashed the front of my car. And my dad had a friend who did some auto body work, and so I took my car to him, and he repaired it. And I went to pick up my car, and he gave me the keys for my car, and I said to him, I said, how much do I owe you? And he said, you don't owe me anything. And I said, I don't owe you anything? He said, no, your dad has been such a good friend to me all of my life. He's done a lot of great things for me, and because of that, I owe this to you. And in essence, what he was saying was, because I love your dad, I love you. And that is so true when it comes to this in a spiritual sense. If we love our Heavenly Father, it's going to be manifested in how we love the people around us. That's why John would say in 1 John, he said, the person who says they love God but yet hate their brother, he says, they're a liar. And the truth is not in them. Because the person who truly loves God, it's a spiritual indicator in how they love the people around them. And if you're going to love God, you're going to love the people around you, and you're not going to do any harm to them, but instead you're going to always lead with love. And then Paul wrapped up these 3 verses, this very succinct definition of love, and he gives the reason for love. Why is it that we should love the people around us? Why is it that we should love the people who are like us as well as the people who are not like us? Why is it that we should love the people that we get along with? And why is it that we should love our sandpaper people? Why should we love the people who irritate us and push all of our buttons? Well, Paul says this in verse 11, and he said, and do this. What's the this? Okay. Anybody awake this morning? Okay. Love. Okay. He says the requirement of love, the response of love. I want you to love. I want you to do this. Why does he want us to do this? He said, understanding the present time. He said, I want you to do this. I want you to be loving towards all the people around you because you understand the present time. Now, again, there were 2 words that Paul could have used here. He could have used the Greek word where we get our English word chronological, which means, chronological time. But that's not the word that he used here. The word he used here talked about the quality of time. Where sometimes we say, hey, it was an exciting time or it was a depressing time. Didn't talk about chronology, but it talked about the quality of that time. And that's the word that Paul used here. He says, I want you to love one another, understanding the time in which we live. This was true in first century Rome, as well as 21st century Bellwood. He said, I want you to love, understanding the times that we live, because we live in times that are divisive and deflating and draining. And in light of the times in which we live, he says the characteristic that you should be leading all of your interactions with is love. Right? Because you can't be patient unless you're loving. You can't be accepting unless you're loving. You can't be peaceful unless you're loving. He said all of these are grounded in love. He said, do this, understand in the present time, the hour has come for you to wake up from your slumber, because our salvation is nearer now than when we first believed. He says, believers, I need you to wake up. I need you to wake up and start being known for your love for one another, because today we're closer to the end than we were yesterday. And time is running out. I remember when I worked at the school, I was in a third grade classroom and I had my watch on, and all of my digital clocks I have set to 24-hour time, which we would commonly refer to as military time. And so I was sitting there in this classroom with this third grade classroom, and a little boy walked up and he wanted to know what time it was, and he looked at my watch and it said 13:45. And he looked at me and he said, Dr. Shook, it's never been that late before. And it's a great spiritual reminder that today, it's never been this late before. And time is very quickly running out. And there's a world that is around us that needs to hear, needs to see, and needs to experience the love of Jesus through the committed followers of Christ. That's why Paul would say, do this, understanding the times in which we live. And even if Jesus doesn't return in our lifetime, like every wrinkle on our face, every gray hair that comes out of our head, every funeral that we attend, every ache and pain that we have in the morning just reminds us the time is running out. And because of that truth, he says, I want you to lead with love. So, because all of that is true, what should we do? What should we do? In light of the command here, in light of the requirement of love, the response of love, the reason we're to love, what should we do? And I want to encourage you today to be decisive. Just be decisive. Because I want you to know this, and I think you know this, that love actually is a choice. Love is not a feeling. Love is not an emotion. Love is a choice. It's a decision. Okay? Right? Because if love was not a decision, if love was just a choice, or if love was just a feeling, or love was just an emotion, we could not be commanded to love. And so what I want you to do is make the decision, be decisive to love the people around you. And as I thought about that, there's a question that keeps coming up in my mind. It's a question that I asked myself a lot of times last week while I was with all my in-laws. It's a question I've asked a lot of times as I've been in interactions with people, and even as I think about my sandpaper people. This question keeps coming up, and it's a question, and I think that if we would genuinely and seriously ask it of ourselves in that moment, it'll help us to be more decisive in our loving attitudes and actions and decisions towards the people around us. And the question is just simply this: what does love require of me? At this moment in this relationship, what does love require of me? In this interaction with this person that rubs me the wrong way, what does love require of me? This person who has harmed me emotionally or relationally, what does love require of me? That moment when I just want to write this person off, what does love require of me? I had mentioned it at the beginning of the message, but in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, the Apostle Paul gave a great example, great definition of love. And you can go back and you can read it, but in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, he tells us that love is patient, love is kind, and is not jealous. Love does not brag, it is not arrogant, it does not act becomingly, it does not seek its own, it is not provoked. He goes on and he tells us that love does not take into account a wrong suffered, it does not rejoice in unrighteousness, but rejoices with the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. And then he concludes this entire description of love with these words. He says, love never fails. So what does love require of me? Listen, there are times in which you're going to ask that question, and love may require your time. Love may require you to give up your rights. Love may require your convenience or your comfort. Love may require you to say something when you don't want to say something. Love may require you to refrain from saying something when you do want to say something. What does love require of me? And when you ask that question, then actually live it out in obedience. As you follow Jesus and love the people around you, lead with love. Because love is not a feeling, love is a decision. And you know this, every single day, you're going to meet grumpy, irritating, sandpaper, button pushing, abrasive people in your life, and then you're going to have to go to work. We're all going to encounter those people, and we're going to have to make the decision to love. And you see, this love that Paul has talked about is not love that's dependent on how they act. It's not dependent on how they treat me, but the love that Paul has described here depends solely on my decision. And he says, I want you to love the you next to you, even if that you is not like you. Be decisive and lead with love. Forgive them and accept them and bear with them and love them. When you're decisive in your love for others, it's going to orient you in such a way that those sandpaper people may actually be helpful in bringing out the beauty in your life. And who knows, maybe your love towards them may change that sandpaper person into a velvet person. So be decisive and lead with love. And you will be glad that you did. In just a couple months, it'll mark 2 years that my mom passed away. And it was a long road near the end of my mom's life. There was an injury and surgeries and in and out of hospitals and a nursing home and rehab and all of those things. And I vividly remember the last conversation I had with my mom. It was on the phone. Beth and I were actually walking, and we were down here by the school. And I was talking to my mom on the phone, and we were laughing and joking around. And then Beth wanted to talk to my mom. And so Beth talked to my mom and asked her a question. And the phone just went silent. And I said, well, it was you, Beth. She just didn't want to talk to you. And so I got the phone back from Beth, and I said, I started talking again, and there was no response from my mom. And I said these words. I said, Mom, I don't know what's happened here. I don't know if you can hear me, but I want you to know that I love you. And I hung up the phone. And those were the last words I said to my mother. And I was reminded of that as I was thinking about this message, because one day there's going to be the last day that you're going to have the opportunity to show and share the love of Jesus with the people in your life. So be decisive and lead with love. Father, we thank you for your word today. Thank you for the power and the application that it has for our lives. I thank you for the love that you have demonstrated for us. And I pray that you would give us the supernatural ability to love others as you have loved us. And all of us, we know that we have those people in our lives who just always seem to rub us the wrong way. But God, I pray that in all of our interactions and all of our actions and all of our reactions, we would always lead with love. And so I pray that you would give us that ability, and pray that you would be honored and glorified in all that we say and do. And it's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.